Hi everyone, welcome back to our last talk of the day here in the DevOps track. DevOps track. Oops, oops, oops. Hope you've been able to hold on through the whole day. It has been a long day, full of great talks. And this last one is one that I've been looking forward to for a while. It's by Dawn E. Collett, and it's called Accessibility Overlays: A Cautionary Tale. And we are going to take advantage of one of the benefits of being online, because this is a pre-recorded talk, but Dawn is here with us and will be able to talk to you and answer questions while also presenting to you simultaneously. So do ask questions in the chat there, and hopefully at the end we'll also be able to get Dawn on and do some interactive Q&A as well to round out the day. So now we'll throw over to the talk by Dawn.
Hello everyone and welcome to PyCon AU 2021, once again from the comfort of your own home. It's great to be back here again this year. Today I will be talking to you about a cautionary tale from the modern tech industry, and that is about accessibility overlays. If you do want to follow along as I'm speaking, then you can go to the GitHub link on the slide that's up at the moment, which will show you my sources, or you can just scan the QR code with your phone and then you'll be able to bring up my sources. Before we start, I do want to take the time to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, on whose land this talk was recorded, and all of the other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and groups around Australia. This is and always will be Aboriginal land. Their sovereignty was never ceded. Now, this story starts when, a year and change ago, I went out and I bought myself a new laptop. This is a picture of it. It is a ThinkPad X1 Carbon. It is a fantastic laptop, and the range of stickers on it should be absolutely no surprise whatsoever to anyone who knows me well at all. And whenever I buy myself a new machine, I have a sort of run book that I go through in terms of things that I need to set up. And as part of that run book, one thing that I generally set up very early on when I acquire a new machine is NVDA, the free and open source screen reader for Windows. Now, I don't do that because I rely on screen readers in the day-to-day. I will generally do that because it's very useful to have a screen reader on your machine to test websites, particularly if you are going to give websites to blind or vision impaired people or screen reader users. It's good to be able to test them so that you can get a feel for what's going on those websites. And so as I'm going through the rest of the run book of things that I tend to set up, downloading other programs, setting up ad blocking and script blocking software on my machine, I hear this really odd phrase. Something that I've never actually heard NVDA say to me before. Press Alt+1 for screen reader mode. And I thought about that, and I thought, that's a bit weird. I don't think that sounds like a common command prompt or a common prompt that NVDA would give me. And then I realized that I'd heard about these things before. Welcome to the world of accessibility overlays. If you ask the people who develop and sell accessibility overlays, then they are a one-line of code solution that you can add to your website, which will automatically remediate all kinds of accessibility issues. And you might think that that sounds too good to be true. But in order to test that claim, first of all, we need to understand a little bit about disability rights, and primarily how disability rights have kind of grown and changed with the advent of the internet. Because in a lot of countries around the world, disability rights legislation actually predates the widespread use of the internet. And spoiler, more often than not, if you want to exercise your disability rights on the internet, you do actually have to sue for them. And we can demonstrate this by having a look at some lawsuits around the world. And this little tour starts in 2010, when a blind lady by the name of Donna Jodden, someone who used a screen reader to get around the internet, decided that she wanted to apply for a job with the Canadian government. And so she, using her screen reader, found her way to the Canadian government jobs website, and she discovered that it was in fact inaccessible. She could not navigate around it with her screen reader. And so she did what many, many people before her have had to do in order to exercise their disability rights, and she filed a lawsuit against the Canadian government. She won that lawsuit. She won again on appeal. And the end result of that was that the Canadian government was required to make their government jobs website accessible, not just to screen reader users, but to all sorts of other people with disabilities. And so that was kind of the first frontier, establishing that in Canada, the government had the obligation to make all of their websites accessible. Then we come to Australia, where we're going to go and do some grocery shopping at Coles. And we're going to ride along here with a lady by the name of Giselle Mesnage, a Sydney-sider, blind from birth and a screen reader user. Now, being someone who enjoyed her independence, she very often did her grocery shopping using Coles Online. And when she started doing that in 2008, the Coles Online shopping website was actually perfectly accessible to her. But after a couple of redesigns, that was no longer the case. And she didn't want to go straight out and acquire herself a lawyer. So initially, she actually tried to engage in a dialogue with Coles to sit down and sort of have a discussion with them about, hey, can we look at ways that we can actually, that you can actually improve this website so that I'm going to be able to use it? And after that turned out to be fruitless, she decided that she had to go for the nuclear option, and so she went and again acquired a lawyer and she sued Coles. This actually ended much quicker than the Canadian government jobs website lawsuit, because I imagine what happened here was that a few lawyers at Coles probably sat around a boardroom, probably in their Hawthorn office, and they probably had a long discussion that ended in a lot of oh dear and a lot of swear words. And they decided, to their credit, that the best way to deal with this lawsuit was to settle it. Part of the settlement that Giselle Mesnage and Coles came to was that Coles were actually required then to make their online shopping website accessible. And that's something that they still have a really strong commitment to today. But oddly enough, if we talk particularly about legislation around disability, the home of disability legislation is a country that many people might not think of immediately when they think of it, and that is the United States of America. 31 years ago, just a bit over 31 years ago in the US, they passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was widely considered at the time, and still is actually, to be one of the most comprehensive pieces of legislation that covers disability and disability access and disability rights issues. And one thing that they tend to talk about a lot that's actually specifically defined in the Americans with Disabilities Act is the concept of a place of public accommodation. And that's not just saying, that the government has to be accessible, that if you were to go to the White House or to Congress, that they have to be accessible. What we're actually saying when we talk about a place of public accommodation is that anywhere in public where you would expect people to go has to be accessible under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that means that if you wanted to, say, go down to your local Domino's Pizza and order some pizza for yourself and whomever might be with you at the time, Domino's Pizza is required, if you are, say, blind, to make that Domino's Pizza outlet accessible to you. But what happens when you don't want to walk down to your local Domino's Pizza to order yourself a pizza? You want to use Domino's online website instead. Well, a gentleman by the name of Guillermo Robles, also blind, also a screen reader user, did in fact try to order a pizza on the Domino's Pizza online ordering website, and he discovered, probably to nobody's surprise at this point, that it was not accessible to him. So again, entered into the kind of process that the ADA requires around an interactive discussion, eventually had to get himself a lawyer. Now, unlike Donna Jordan and Giselle Mesnage, Guillermo Robles actually lost his case in the lower court, and it was appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. What happened here when it was appealed to the Supreme Court was they actually said this case has been decided incorrectly. They remanded it back to the lower court to be decided. And what we might find as a result of that is that, along with the right that exists already in countries like Canada and Australia that's been tested through lawsuits, that in the US it may soon become the case that places of public accommodation are not just physical outlets, that the virtual world also has to be a place of public accommodation as well. So if your Domino's Pizza franchise has to be accessible physically, the e-commerce site by where you would go and order some pizza equally has to be accessible. So before we go back to the accessibility overlays, let's kind of go through some of the things that we have to do in order to make websites accessible. And because a lot of the lawsuits and a lot of the cases that we're talking about here have been around screen reader users, we will also look, or I sort of want to focus here on common access fails specifically related to screen reader use. And there are quite a few of them. You've got things like incorrect heading levels, because screen reader users tend to use the heading level to actually navigate a website and work out whether they want to read all of the body text. So if you mess up your heading levels, or you've got, neatly defined heading levels visually, but not neatly defined heading levels when you're tabbing through that the screen reader can read to you, that's going to be a problem in terms of people being able to find the text that they want. Another concern that you've got there is around things like poorly labeled tables, poorly labeled graphs, or even graphs where you've just stuck an image up and there's no way for a screen reader user to actually see the raw information there. A lot of these things can be fixed by just proper formatting, but something that can't necessarily be fixed by proper formatting is things like drop-downs, buttons, and other widgets that you would commonly see in HTML. And there are two ways to make those accessible. The older way of doing it is with ARIA tags, which are basically just tags that tell the screen reader what to read out and how to navigate. But in modern HTML, we have a concept of semantic HTML, which is where a lot of these things have already been done. And so all you need to do then is make sure that you use the semantic HTML element, which is fully accessible to a screen reader. And finally, one other thing that tends to be a fairly big issue is not just images of graphs, but images in general, because obviously blind or visually impaired people can't necessarily see images. And so what we need to do then is to basically allow the screen reader to see the image for its user. And the way that you do that is by writing alt text, which is basically a fairly short description of the image. You generally don't want it to be longer than about a paragraph that gets across all of the critical information in it. And you attach the alt text to the image, and then when the screen reader actually comes to focus on the image, what it will read out is not just, oh, there's an image here, but here is the alt text that the person, that a sighted person has used to describe this image. And you might look at a lot of those fairly common issues and go, this is something that should probably be solvable using modern AI and machine learning. Well, about that. I did a talk at LinusConf AU 2021 earlier this year called The Privacy Tax. It was generally focused on the topic of disability and security, particularly around things like tracking and storage and misuse of personal data. But one thing that I actually did during the process of this talk was, rather than introducing myself in the typical way, I decided that I was going to get an AI to introduce me to the audience for everyone. And I learned some very interesting things from that. This is one of the images that I used to introduce myself. This is a picture of me with one of the cows at the Moving Art installation in Shepperton, which was taken in November 2018. Now, I had actually trained an ML classifier to describe images for me, and specifically what I was looking at was the way that it described people, to see could it pick up on signs of visible disabilities. And you notice obviously the walking stick there. But if I was going to go and describe this image, I would describe it as something like, this is Dawn wearing a Boston Red Sox baseball cap, black shirt with white print and pink trousers, holding a blue walking stick, and sitting on a cow that's painted green and blue like a mermaid. And that would give you a fairly good description, if you were reading that, of what the image might look like without any superfluous information. But the absolute best that I could get out of the ML model that I trained, and do bear in mind that this was only to describe people, was that I was a man in black and white t-shirt and pink pants sitting on green object with blue and red stick. Now that gives you a pretty good description of me, but it doesn't really give you a good description of what's going on around me. And bear in mind, this was an ML model that I had trained for this purpose. You know, you look at companies like Microsoft, they have massive training data sets, they have massive amounts of information that they can use. And even they have not really been able to solve the problem of having images described via machine learning to pick up on all of the important points. So that might give you some idea when we start having a look at the claims that these accessibility overlay companies make about how easy it really is to bridge the gap using entirely automated solutions. And these accessibility overlay companies started sprouting up, you know, in the late 2000s, early 2010s. And what they were trying to do was to solve the problem of automating solutions to web accessibility. And they make a lot of really bold claims. Some that I've pulled from their websites. Things like keep safe from lawsuits, comply with legislation 24/7. One particular overlay company bills itself as the only solution that meets ADA, that's the Americans with Disabilities Act, and WCAG, or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, 2.1 compliance through a combination of advanced automation technology and human touch. Advanced automation technology, I like it. Alternatively, another company suggests that you can deploy this company's advanced website accessibility solutions without refactoring your website's existing code. And this is a really bold claim because what they're saying is that you have to make no changes whatsoever in order to make your website accessible. You just go away, you deploy their code, and then it works. But in practice, if you look at the ways that people have tended to traditionally remediate a lot of these accessibility issues, even the best compliance checkers, and that's just checking to see whether your website meets the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, not actually remediating it, can only sort of pick up on about 50 to 60% of the criteria. And I sort of understand why a lot of companies have looked to accessibility overlays for solutions and why they've proliferated as much as they have, because if you consider the amount of money that it takes, you know, particularly if you're a small business, places like Coles, the Canadian government, Domino's Pizza, you expect them to have the money to fix these sorts of things. But a small business that might not have had anyone work on their website for a few years, or might only have one or two people developing it, or might be, you know, outsourcing it to someone, some external consultancy, they're not necessarily going to have the money to be able to remediate a lot of these accessibility issues. So the accessibility overlays sound like a really appealing solution. But in practice, when I heard that little soundbite of, you know, press Alt+1 to enter screen reader mode, and having realized what was actually going on here through the work of a whole lot of excellent people who post about accessibility on LinkedIn, many of whom are linked in the sources, I thought, okay, let's actually take this for a bit of a test drive. And what I found was a bit of a mess. I found things like headers being inaccurate. Predictably, as you would see from my little experiment with machine learning earlier, the ML descriptions that it provided for images where a human hadn't written them were pretty putrid and often didn't actually get across critical information. Graphs were just a cluttered mess. But one thing that's really interesting here, before we even look at how well they actually work, is that little soundbite, press Alt+1 to enter screen reader mode. When I gave the privacy tax, I talked about the concept of detecting screen readers. I said that a lot of people really want to do it. I said that it's very difficult to do. I also said that it's a terrible idea for a number of reasons. It's a terrible idea because you don't know whether there are people sitting with your screen reader user trying to actually work out what's going on while you're serving different content. It's also a terrible idea because you're actually detecting a disability. So at least for this particular overlay that I had encountered, it started with an anti-pattern. Everything that it was doing was based on an anti-pattern, and that was the anti-pattern of detecting a disability. And that's just for screen reader users. So in short, what we really have here, if you look at these accessibility overlays, is a good old-fashioned case of snake oil. Always good, particularly good when you're talking about things that actually affect people's access to websites that they would be using day to day. In fact, in many cases, if you go and talk to people who are much more learned on the topic of accessibility and screen readers than I, people who use these screen readers day to day, they will actually tell you that in many cases these accessibility overlays make websites worse. In fact, a gentleman by the name of Adrian Roselli, really good accessibility guy, I absolutely recommend you follow him if you're into this kind of thing, had produced a blog post when these accessibility overlays had been proliferating for a while. And it was titled, Accessiby Will Get You Sued. Accessiby being the name of, one of these sort of more popular accessibility overlay companies. And he wasn't wrong, because the lawsuit started. And they kept coming. And they kept coming. And they kept on coming, and it wasn't just Accessiby that was being sued, it was websites that used all kinds of accessibility overlay products. And that kind of gets to the core of the critical promise that was made here, which was, this is going to be an automated solution to all of your problems. The thing is, though, that the reality of this is if I were to go in somewhere and I were to say to you, I have a one-line solution to all of your security problems. You can deploy this one line of code to your website and it will solve all of your security issues. You would either laugh me out of the room or you would conclude that I was a salesperson for a cloud provider, which very often, do sell you one-line security solutions with the small side effect that they tend to cost you absolutely exorbitant amounts of money. So the lesson that I want to take from this is not that accessibility companies are bad. It's not that accessibility is even necessarily hugely difficult to do. But it's that these products are built on an anti-pattern. They're built on an anti-pattern, they follow anti-patterns, and very often, if you talk to the people that they claim to serve, they will tell you that their lives are actually worse with the accessibility overlay than they were without it. That's true to the point where there are instructions, which I promptly used on my new machine, to make accessibility overlays go away on your machine once and for all. Those are also linked in the sources. But the real lesson here, I think, comes back to not a discussion about accessibility, but a discussion about design patterns. So in order to look at how we improve it, we need to discuss the idea of one-issue system design, which is basically when people design systems, very often they're focused on 1, 2, or 3 different things that they're trying to actually solve by designing this system. And that might be that you want it to be really cheap. It might be that you want it to be really easy to navigate. It might be that you want it to be really small code-wise. It might be, that you want it to have all of these features. It might even be that you want it to be accessible or you want it to be secure. But if you only take 1 or 2 or 3 things from the list of all of the different considerations that need to come into play when you design a system, that ends up basically being the path to crushing technical debt in practice. And so part of what we can learn from this sort of issue of accessibility overlays is about the comprehensive design processes that would reduce or eliminate the need for these quick fix solutions to begin with. Because as I and basically everyone else in the tech world will tell you, it's much cheaper to solve a problem from the beginning than it is to go back and try and retrofit a solution later. So part of comprehensive design processes is that you don't just pick 1 or 2 or 3 things off that list. You actually sit down at the beginning and you go, let's look at all of these considerations that we might need to look at. Things like cost, ease of use, accessibility, security, size of the actual code itself, and build yourself a comprehensive design plan that addresses all of those from the beginning. It's much easier to do those things from the start than it is to have to go in later and remediate it, because you'll inevitably find yourself cutting corners. But in terms of specifically accessibility, there are a few lessons that would reduce or eliminate the need for these overlays, well, the perceived need for these overlays that probably doesn't actually exist as well. And the first one is that when you talk about a lot of modern front-end frameworks, things like React, Vue, Angular, Rails, these are all, even CMS systems, content management systems like WordPress, these are all accessible to greater or lesser degrees. And so the first thing you can actually do if you're using a framework and you're not building it from scratch is check, is the framework that you're using accessible? And if it's not, or if you find yourself having to do, they have the basics, but you find yourself having to do a significant amount of manual work, then look at how do you remediate that? Can you remediate it once and not have to do it all over your system? Are there pre-existing plugins? There are actually a lot for things like WordPress that do resolve a lot of those accessibility issues and actually build accessible components for you to build on. And if you go out and do those fixes yourself, can you either release them as a plugin or go back to the people who maintain the framework and say to them, this needs to be something that you can address. Here's a pull request that addresses some of the common issues that we had accessibility-wise. And the more that we do things like that, the easier accessibility really becomes for everyone. Because if you start building with accessible building blocks, the amount of work that you're going to have to do to remediate those issues later down the line is not something that you're going to feel. Whereas if you start with a sort of framework that's inaccessible, you're really going to feel having to resolve it. And even then, if you've got a website where it's completely inaccessible and you've got to solve a lot of these issues, accessibility overlays are not necessarily the way to go. The best way to go is to look for some kind of sticking plaster, a temporary solution that only automates the things that really can be automated, while you take the time to do that remediation work. The other time where those sorts of sticking plasters can be really useful is in the sense of plugins that fix basic issues with an inaccessible framework. But even then, you may find it takes a little bit of work to actually get it all sorted, and you are going to have to do some manual work on top of that to make your sites accessible. The really sad thing, and the heavily ironic thing about this cautionary tale, is that these accessibility overlays came with one promise, and you heard it with the excerpts that I read out to you. We are going to avoid you getting sued. You will not get sued if you use this framework. But as you can see from the list of lawsuits that Adrian Roselli has curated, unfortunately, these accessibility quick fixes have resulted in a paradox of more and more lawsuits and more complaints, many of them from reputable organizations like the San Francisco Lighthouse for the Blind, whose real aim is to ensure that in the spirit and not just the letter of that disability access legislation, that the web is accessible to everyone. We may or may not now have some time for questions. If we don't, I will be around. Otherwise, my website and email address are up there, so feel free to get in contact with me. It's been lovely to talk to you, and I do hope that you've learned something not just about accessibility, but about some of the broader failures in design thinking that lead us to this point.
Well, thank you, Dawn. That was a great talk. Really interesting nuances in there about how people are trying to solve this and ultimately failing, but also some great advice for what we can actually do, which I think is tremendous. Now we actually have a question or two, so thank you for coming around to the end of the talk where you can answer them. So I'll feed them to you. To everyone else, if you have questions, do drop them into the chat. And then I'll see them usually on a slight delay after that happens. And then, so put it in there, and then by the time you've asked the question, we'll be ready. So Dawn, when you're working with an existing non-accessible system, have you seen drivers other than compliance that motivate companies to implement any fixes?
Oh, so I have a whole half talk, half rant on this, because often it will come down to, so companies kind of fall into three buckets. You've got companies that don't really think about it. You've got companies where the primary driver for it is compliance, and they tend to be the types of companies that will actually use these, accessibility overlays which are effectively snake oil. And I'm sometimes amazed by what those companies are. Like I discovered last week that there's a disability charity, fairly, a sizable disability charity based out of Victoria that uses one of these products on their website, which is mildly horrifying. The third bucket is companies where there's a fairly significant internal culture around accessibility. And that there you tend to be looking at companies with very diverse hiring practices because, it's about 1 in 5 people worldwide. And so the chances are if you have a company that hires well, a significant proportion of their workforce will be disabled. And there'll be another significant proportion of their workforce that is close to or deals on a regular basis with other disabled people. And so they're the ones that tend to have that non-compliance-based lens of, let's actually look at this in terms of what's the right thing to do, what's going to get people using our website rather than what do we have to do to comply with lawsuits 24/7 or whatever that bit of marketing copy was.
Right, yeah. So related to that, and it sort of relates to security in some ways, like you sort of alluded to this, of making it easier for ourselves to do this well and having those fundamental building blocks that we can build on top of. Are there particular areas, or like I'm thinking web frameworks or technologies that lots of people build on, that we should kind of all address and maybe use our leverage and power to get at those, because that will have the greatest impact? Are there places that we should be focusing?
Yeah. It's primarily web frameworks, as you said. So you're looking at things like the React, Angular's Vues of the world, Ruby on Rails, but also content management systems. So things like WordPress. If you're using static site templating, so Hugo is one that comes to mind. Things like Django, Drupal, basically anything where the components themselves are already built into, where it's not that you're building components yourselves out of raw HTML, where there is some level of styling or configuration that has gone into the components. That's where you go. If they're open source, you go to their maintainers and you go, here is a pull request. Or if they're not open source, you release your plugin as open source. That's where the bang for your buck is.
Right. So one last question. It's sort of the end of the day. Hopefully this is an easy one for people to take away. But what is one thing that we could all do that would improve the situation? Something that's super simple that we can just do as we go about our everyday that will make life better for everyone else who comes after us.
Okay, so I'm actually going to give you 2 things here. One which is related to the topic of the talk and one which is not.
Okay.
Tell everyone that you know who does web development, do not use accessibility overlays, because as it stands, there is not a single product that I feel actually meets the specifications. And in the sources, I have linked a number of videos breaking down a number of products, and spoiler, none of them actually do what they claim to do. But in the broader sense of accessibility, what I would say is keep pushing and make sure that you have a way for an accessible way for people to actually get accessibility feedback to you about your product. So whether that be, that your forums need to be accessible, or whether that be that you need to not be printing your phone number on your website needs to not be in an image and it needs to be somewhere that screen readers can read. If you give disabled people a way to actually say, hey, there are problems, usually they'll be pretty good about it because they want to access stuff and then take that feedback and action it.
Excellent advice. Oh, we do have one last bonus question, which is I won't get you to answer all of it because it's to do with references. Basically, is there any recommended reading to better understand how we can make our systems more accessible? Do you have some resources that you could link people to where they can go and learn some more about this?
Yeah, the sources, if you go right to the bottom of the sources, there's a section about background reading, which has some sources that I've recommended previously, and also a previous talk that I've done, which covers many of the basics of many different types of accessibility, not just for screen readers.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you, Dawn, and thank you for putting all of that effort into a great talk, and like the captioning and everything was tremendous. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Right.